in a great mood this morning. Good morning. Hopefully some of us are in better moods than that. I hope you are excited to be here this morning. I know last week was really good to see as many people as we had here last week, and then this week seems to be kicking off right where we left off there. Notice the 2 weeks before that, half the church came down with COVID, and so it was kind of empty, and it was kind of quiet, and it was kind of lonely around here. So it's nice to see all the faces back here, and it's kind of nice to have to wait a little bit for people to calm down before we can get started with Sunday school, and then people to calm down before we can get started with the service. So I'm just excited people are here, excited to talk to each other. But we talked about this Sunday, are we an inviting church? As excited as we are to be here this morning, and as people come in and they start talking to one another, you can see people's faces light up. Well, if you're excited about being here, and you're excited to experience what we offer here, why don't you want to share that excitement? Why don't you want to share that experience? That's what we talked about this morning in Sunday school, and it really got me thinking. Often the people that we would invite are people that go to other churches. Well, we don't need to invite them. They go to another church. Yes, it's nice to visit other churches just so you don't have to hear me week after week after week. I don't want to hear me week after week after week, but here I am standing up here still talking. But it's those people who don't go to church, who don't have anywhere to go on Sunday. Those are the people we should be looking at. Those are the people we should be looking to. Those are the people we should be praying about, getting excited about the opportunity to invite them to things. And I know Sunday mornings aren't the easiest thing because, well, we're a small church of Q-tips, as some people would phrase it. But next week provides a good opportunity to be able to get out of the church situation or the church building and make it maybe a little easier to invite people to something as far as a whole community gathering. So that's why we do what we do as far as Labor Day services and joint services go. So that's a little plug for next week's service as far as the Labor Day community service goes. I also know that Round Lake will be having their family camp, so that's also another experience to come together with other believers and to invite people outside of a church experience into something larger than ourselves. So after I get off that rant, I'll actually get into the sermon here this morning. We're in part 4 of our series on church history. In the last couple of weeks, we've been building this up into, I had to give you some context the very first week, and then built it up with the kind of context of what was happening outside of the church. And then just last week, we kind of talked about what was happening inside the church just a little bit. And here we get into kind of the forefathers of the church. Here we talk about the patristic age last week. That's just a fancy way of saying the church fathers. The early church fathers is the patristic age of the church. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the 3 main apostolic fathers. The 3 main apostolic fathers. Now, this is just another fancy term for saying the guys who came after the apostles. So at this point, all the apostles are dead, and so these guys are what was left. So we go from the fancy term of the apostolic fathers to saying the guys who were left around after all of the apostles were gone. And so we're going to talk about 3 main figures today. The first figure we're going to talk about is Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome. Now this guy is kind of an interesting figure. However, I should preface this as we talk about these 3 men. These 3 men didn't fare all that well. Much like much of the early church didn't fare all that well. In fact, it's estimated that somewhere between 1 million to 3 million Christians in the first 250 years of the church were killed. And we think we're persecuted as Christians today. Let me repeat that again. 1 million to 3 million Christians were persecuted or killed simply because they said they were Christian. There's this illustration that I found that there was once a pastor named Ptolemaeus. And Ptolemaeus had this couple within his church, and the wife was a Christian. The wife was present within the church, and the husband wasn't as much. Now, these were Roman citizens and in Roman culture. And so, because of their differences, because of their fighting, their quarreling, and their differences of beliefs, there was a divorce that was sought. And so during their trial, there was a judge named Urbicus. And Urbicus was the judge proceeding over this trial, and he asked to see Ptolemaeus along with the wife, because it was the pastor of the wife who kind of was maybe helping her along with this divorce proceeding because of the differing of beliefs. And so the judge spoke to Urbicus and said, well, because you're a Christian and because it's your fault that you're doing this, that you're seeking the divorce of these people, then maybe it's you that should be put on trial. Well, this didn't really make sense to Ptolemaeus. Why was he being put on trial? Well, he was being put on trial for what he was professing. He was professing Jesus, and because her husband wasn't professing Jesus, then this woman should be able to leave her husband because of her differing opinions. And so as this trial went on, Ptolemaeus was then executed. And after he was executed, then this man named Lucius stood up, and he questioned Urbicus and said, why do you persecute this man simply because he's a Christian? You put this man to death simply because he follows Jesus. You didn't put this man to death because he was a robber, because he was a murderer, because he was sexually immoral, because he did anything against anyone, but because of the things he did for people. You committed him to death. And Urbicus, because of Lucius's speech here, says, well, you sound awfully like a Christian too. And Lucius replied, well, I am. And so Urbicus had Lucius put to death. And then a third man stands up and says, why do you persecute these Christians? I myself am a Christian too. And so then this third man was also executed. Now, this is a common illustration to show how easy it was throughout this time of the church to be persecuted simply by saying you were a Christian. And so we have to realize that these three men that we're talking about today are not only taking on the name Christian, but they are given the guidance of the churches in which they were at. And so Clement's name here pretty easily tells you that he was Clement of Rome, which meant he was the bishop of the Roman Church. And actually, if we look into this a little bit, Paul actually mentions Clement by name. Now, we don't get much of this in the Old Testament or the New Testament, that we get a specific name that we can later point to as a head of one of the churches. And so it's interesting here to see Paul mention this in Philippians 4, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stay true to the Lord. I love you and long to see you, dear friends. For you are my joy and the crown I receive for my work. Now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche. Please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. And I ask you, my true partner, to help these two women. For they worked hard with me in telling others the good news. They worked along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Now Paul is writing this to the Philippian church, to the church in Philippi. He is saying that help these women. And he kind of mentions some of the things that these women did, but he's kind of giving them his affirmation. He's kind of giving them an appointment to the Philippian church that they helped me, so please help them. And they even helped Clement and my other co-workers. So we can tell that these people are coming from Rome because of the persecution in Rome to Philippi. And so this is why Paul mentions Clement here, because of his position within the church of Rome. And so it gives these women further credence into what they're doing. And so we talk about Clement of Rome. He was the bishop of the church in Rome. Now, it's kind of interesting here. We get into this debate, especially if you grew up in a Catholicism point of view. You'll notice oftentimes Peter is accredited to be the first pope. Well, after Peter, it gets kind of confusing on who was on further down the line. If we look at the order of things, the way Peter appointed bishops was directly after Peter. Peter appointed two men named Lucius and Apostolic. Now, these two men were considered the community outreach people, or the community ministers, if you will. They were appointed to the outreach ministry where Peter kind of was over. Church. These two other men, Lucius and Apostolic, kind of helped provide the spiritual needs of the community. But then after that, Paul also appointed Clement of Rome. But Clement he appointed to oversee the entirety of the church. So the church and the community within the church. And so there's debate on whether Clement was the second, the third, or even possibly the fourth in line of succession of Peter. But we don't get into this until the later half of the 100s to 200s, or the 2nd century. I bring that up because that's going to get later into some of our topics on the growing of the Catholic Church as we know it today. But if we look at, he studied under the Apostle Simon Peter, so this is where he gets his reference. He is directly under the Apostle Peter. So Jesus had his disciples, and then after Jesus' death and resurrection, the disciples then kind of carried along their own disciples. And so this is where we get the early church fathers. On top of this, we'll talk about the other two men here later, but each of the apostles had their own apostles that they would appoint to different areas. It's interesting here because the next two men were directly studied under John, the Apostle John. But then on top of that, they were appointed to the churches that they were at through Peter. So it's Peter who appointed these men to the positions in which they were at. Now, if we talk directly about Clement's writings, Clement wrote what we have left. Now, Clement probably wrote tons of letters to the nearby churches, but the letter that survived, the letter that we have today, is known as First Clement. Now, there's some debate on what Second Clement is. Second Clement was more of a sermon outline, if you will, or a sermon to be read to different churches. It's debated on whether that was actually directly from Clement or just written in tribute to Clement. So we won't get too much into that one. First Clement here was written directly to the Corinthian church. Now, who else wrote to the Corinthian church? Well, Paul. And so the issues that Paul wrote about still appear in the issues that Clement wrote about. Now, it's a little bit different here is the fact that the church was in this transition phase. They had one aspect of this older congregation, and they had another aspect of this younger congregation, if you will. And so there were younger elders and deacons being appointed on top of these older elders and deacons that really didn't want to step down. And so there was a lot of infighting between these two. That kind of sounds familiar to today's society, where we have some fighting between the older and the younger, and how we should do life, or how we should do church, or how we should do really pretty much anything. I know at 7 years old, really still fights me and her mom on how to do certain things. But this is really what this is all about, what Clement's letter is boiling down to here. And so in Clement's letter, he does this interesting thing, is he doesn't just write about Paul's influence on him or Peter's influence on him. Clement goes all the way back to the Old Testament. He goes back to the foundations of what Christianity is. He goes back to its Jewish roots. Because remember, if we talked about the very first week, is we don't have Christianity without Judaism. There's no Christ without Abraham first. There's no us without Adam and Eve. And so Clement does a really good job of going back and focusing on its Jewish roots and reminding the people of where we come from. He goes all the way back to Cain and Abel, to Joseph and his brothers, to Saul, King Saul, and later would be King David. Now, the common thread between these is that there was an estranged relationship, that there was a detachment between these people. Now, with the estrangement of Cain and Abel, we know that didn't end up too well. We can look to Joseph and his brothers. You can tell that their relationship wasn't all that well when his brothers decided to throw him into a pit. That doesn't usually tell you that they're on very good terms. However, that relationship ended up being resolved. And we'll look back into this. And then we look into the story of King Saul and David. That story didn't really have all the niceties or a happy ending there either. But if we look back into these stories, if we look back into King Saul and David, David had compassion on Saul. David held mercy for Saul. David tried to fix that relationship as best as possible, or to hold on to some kind of relationship as best as possible, but it didn't work. Likewise, Cain and Abel, they didn't try to fix a relationship. It was over really before it ended. Before that relationship could be fixed, could be mended, it was over. And so we have two extremes here on what can happen. One side can try to fix a relationship, or there can be no fix to the relationship. However, Joseph and his brothers, we kind of see it being amended. We kind of see it being fixed because both parties came together. Both parties needed each other in order to survive, to move on. And this is what Clement is getting at. That these two sides, the younger deacons and the younger elders, shouldn't be fighting with the older deacons and the older elders. They should be coming together. Not just screaming about their differences, but discussing their differences. Talking about how they can come together in peace, but on top of that, come together because of love. Come together in love and come together in unity in order to advance the church. The younger generation wanted to advance the church, and we know from our studies last week that the older generation didn't necessarily like the advancements. How things have changed, that older people don't like change and younger people want to change. So we see nothing has changed as far as human tradition goes. But Clement is earnestly seeking that these people come together to love each other because Jesus loved them. Jesus wanted them to come together, and so Clement wants them to come together, to work through their differences. Peace should be the solution, through working together out of love. That was one of Clement's final appointments in his letter. Now, I was going to read through some of Clement's first letter, but after reading through it, it was 53 chapters. And so I didn't want to bog us down with all of that, so I figured I'd go through this nice summary. But to give you a little picture into who Clement was, this is just part of his prayer near the end of 1 Clement. Speaking to God, speaking about God, you made to appear the enduring fabric of the world by the works of your hands. You, Lord, created the earth in which we dwell. You who is faithful in all generations, just in judgments, wonderful in strength and majesty, with wisdom creating and with understanding fixing the things which were made, who are good among them, that are being saved and faithful among those who trust in you. Clement is saying, God, you created all things. You can mend all things. And it's to you I leave these problems. Clement knew that he couldn't fix these problems. His words may help, but ultimately it was up to God to help these people through their estrangement, through their relationships, through the troubles that they were dealing with. Now, if we talk about these early men, we have to talk about, well, how they met their end. And Clement, just like the others that we'll talk about this morning, ended up meeting a gruesome fate. In Clement's death, he was imprisoned. And you heard the term hard labor. Well, he was sentenced to hard labor working in a stone quarry. And so as he was working in a stone quarry, he noticed that there was very ill treatment to the prisoners around him. Not only just the Christian prisoners, but to all the prisoners. And while he was working, he had this vision of this lamb up on the highest point of the quarry. And so Clement, after the vision was over, he climbed to this highest point, and he took his pickaxe that he had, and he struck the spot where the lamb was. And after he struck the spot where the lamb was, water sprung forth from the rock and cascaded down to all the people. And it said because of this miracle that had happened, that hundreds of the prisoners that were pagans ended up converting because of Clement's witness to them, because of Clement's miracle. Now, we don't know if that story is true. We don't have any historical facts to back that up. There's no historians that were present to write about this, but we kind of assume this to be a little bit of truth because of the way Clement then was executed. Clement, after this, was taken out in a boat to the Black Sea with an anchor tied around him and then thrown off of the boat. And so because of this legend, because of this story, this is how Clement became known as the patron saint of mariners. And so this is how Clement died. This is how Clement was persecuted. And this is how we remember Clement. The next one we go to, this one is a little bit more common, a little bit more popular than name, if not for a bunch of schools, but Ignatius. Now, more specifically, this is Ignatius of Antioch. Now, we didn't have last names back in this time, and so most of the time they went by the town they came from or the town in which they were serving or working. And so here we have Ignatius of Antioch. And I picked a verse here that reminded me very much so of kind of the life that Ignatius lived. And so 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 15 through 17. No, I meant chapter 3. Yep, I put chapter 3 and I wrote down chapter 4. So we're in chapter 3. You have been taught the Holy Scriptures from childhood. They have been given to you the wisdom to receive the salvation that comes by trusting in Christ Jesus. All Scripture is inspired by God and is useful to teach us what is true and to make us realize what is wrong in our lives. It corrects us when we are wrong and teaches us to do what is right. God uses it to prepare and equip His people to do every good work. Now, this was written by Paul to Timothy when Timothy was in charge of the church that he was in charge of. But basically what Paul is saying is the Bible teaches us. The Bible corrects us when we need to. The Bible shows us what is wrong in our lives if we ask for it. That should sound like those prayers that we went through not too long ago in the whole search me, break me, use me. Those should sound familiar to that. But if we look at Ignatius, a majority of his writings actually come after he was arrested. Now, if we look historically at Antioch, this was the new headquarters of Christianity after they were kicked out of Jerusalem. We have to remember that there was another disbursement or another travel of the Christians in Jerusalem out of the city. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. And so they needed new headquarters, and Antioch were those headquarters. And if we look at this, Ignatius was arrested because of his writings. But as he was writing, it was actually as he was traveling from Antioch to Rome. Now, if we look back into ancient history and Roman law, it was kind of rare that a prisoner would be transferred from where they were. Usually they would just be persecuted right in the town that they were at. And if they're a Roman citizen, then they wouldn't be persecuted or treated as a traitor. They would just simply be beheaded. And so it's not 100% sure why Ignatius himself was transferred from Antioch to Rome. But regardless of that, he was. And on his travels, another rare aspect of this is the fact that he gets to preach in each of the towns that they go through. The 10 Roman guards that Ignatius was with allow him to stop into the churches along his travels. Along his travels, Ignatius wrote 6 letters to 6 different churches in the surrounding area. One of those letters being to the next guy that we'll talk about, Polycarp of Smyrna. And so we know that Ignatius and at least Polycarp were at least pen pals. And so as he was going through, there was these focuses that these letters kind of depended on. Ecclesiology, or the study of the church and the church history, which is what we're doing now, is the study of the church history. So that's ecclesiology. So if anybody asks you what you guys are talking about in church, you can tell them ecclesiology. And they'll be really confused and probably not want to come with you, so don't tell them that. The next part was the sacraments and the importance of the sacraments. We have to realize at this point, the sacraments being the bread and the wine. There was some confusion in this early day, especially the secrecy of the church. They kind of tried to keep it under wraps because they didn't want all killed. And so people began to wonder, what were these Christians doing behind these closed doors? What were the sacraments? What was this bread that represented a body? And what was this this wine that represented blood? Were they actually taking part in human flesh and human blood? Now, I know it sounds crazy to us today, but that's what some of these Romans were thinking. In fact, there's some aspects, and we may get into that later, of what the sacraments actually are and actually represent. Do these sacraments actually become literal blood once we take them and literal flesh once we take them? But we'll get into that later. This is where some of these these heresies and blasphemies start coming up and start creeping up inside of church history. And on top of that, he starts talking about the role of church leadership. Well, if Jesus was the leader when Jesus was around, and then the disciples became the leaders after Jesus wasn't around, who becomes the leaders after the apostles aren't around anymore? Well, Ignatius kind of finds himself in that role, whether he wanted to be or not. Ignatius actually emphasized the central figures to the apostles, and to the apostles, much like how I talked about Jesus being the central figure to the apostles, and the apostle being the central figure to, well, the Apostolic Fathers. That's where we get this name from. He also mentioned that the bishops should be appointed to the church to lead each church. Not a central figure that leads all the churches, but an individual leader of an individual church based on that community's needs. And so here we kind of get this confusion between papal powers and between church powers. This is kind of where we start getting this split between the Catholic idea of church and how we know church today. Much like some of the churches actually in this day were bringing in multiple people. Ignatius was of the fact that there should be a single elder preacher and then other elders and leaders around him to help establish him, much like we have here. A lot of the churches had multiple preachers, multiple elders, multiple deacons, and it kind of a modern analogy to too many chefs in the kitchen spoil the meal. You have too many minds, too many words coming out, and you get that split, much like the Clement of Rome talked about to the Corinthian church. On top of this, Ignatius was one of the first writers to really establish the deity of Jesus. To take Jesus as being just a man or a prophet and really elevate him to deity status. Much of Ignatius' work will later go into the references of explaining the Trinity and how to figure out the Trinity. But Ignatius was one of the first to reference this. On top of this, there was also a large emphasis on the sacrament. Not only the sacrament, what it was, but why it is. And Jeff did a good job of kind of explaining that this morning, but the reason we take communion every Sunday is because of its connection to Jesus. How it connects us to Jesus. I wrote down here, there is also a large emphasis on the sacrament. They connect us to Jesus. They bind our hearts, our minds, and our souls to the death and resurrection of Christ. Each time we take communion, each time we place that cracker on our tongue, and each time we drink of the juice, this should be a reminder of that. It binds us to that. It reminds us of our sacrifice of being baptized. Now, we may not think of being baptized as much of a sacrifice. Well, frankly, it shouldn't be much of a sacrifice. What is a simple reenactment of the burial and resurrection of Jesus, and that's why we take part in that. And the communion binds us to that. It's almost like renewing your vows to Jesus each time you take communion. After 10 years, Kristen and I kind of thought about maybe renewing our vows. Now, we didn't get a chance to, but maybe we'll do that in the future. But that's what communion represents. It represents remembering that sacrifice and renewing our commitment to Christ. Next thing we're going to talk about, I guess I kind of skipped through that. Next thing we're going to talk about is Polycarp. Polycarp. Brendan laughed at me when I mentioned we were going to talk about Polycarp because she thought it was a Pokemon. I told my dad I was going to bring that up because he didn't think many people would understand what that was. But I figured I would anyway. And so Polycarp, although it is kind of a funny name, this story is one of the more interesting stories, if you will. And the verse I chose here was, be on guard, stand firm in faith, be courageous, be strong, and do everything with love. Be ready, be strong, be courageous. One of the most commanded sentences, or one of the most commanded terms in the Bible is, do not be afraid. Be strong and be courageous. And again, we see this command: be on guard, stand firm in faith, be courageous, be strong, do everything with love. If you know nothing else about Christianity, we should know this. If we know nothing else about Scripture, we should know this. If someone looks at us, they should see these very things. They should see these very qualities. If they don't, then obviously we have some fixing to do in our own lives because we have failed in some way. People should look at us and they should see us firm in faith. They should see us as courageous. They should see us as strong and full of resolve. But most of all, they should see us living with love. Hopefully you've kind of seen a theme throughout these last 3 men of that concept of love coming back over and over again. So let's get into Polycarp here. Polycarp, as I mentioned before, was the bishop in Smyrna, which is close to modern-day Turkey, or in that kind of area of modern-day Turkey. He studied under the Apostle John just as Ignatius did. And so Ignatius and Polycarp here had some kind of relationship, and they've written letters back and forth to each other on multiple occasions, but most of those are only through oral tradition that we know about today. A lot of these early works are actually lost to us because of oral traditions. Oral traditions meaning everything was spoken about. We actually see a lot of Polycarp's writings holding to New Testament ideals, which means somehow Polycarp would have written or would have read or would have heard the New Testament. A lot of Polycarp's writings go into figuring out what the canon for what we hold today as the Bible. A lot of early scholars, or a lot of people who worked on the canonicity of the Bible, ended up looking to Polycarp's writings to help dissect what should be included and what shouldn't be included. If we look at Polycarp's writing that we have today, that writing is known as the Epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians. Now, I know we got to the whole the apostles' epistles last week, and I won't try to do that tongue twister again this week. But Polycarp's writings to the Philippians are really what turned around kind of these amalgamations of the Bible into really what we know it as today. Now, that's really all that is known about Polycarp and known about what Polycarp's writings really held. The thing that we most know Polycarp for is his firm foundation in his faith, is his strength in his faith. Now, if we look back to how the Romans viewed Christians, it was kind of different from how we view Christians today. Now, if we understand, the Roman religion had many gods, whereas Christian religion only had one God. And the Christian kind of differed from the Jewish rites because they didn't live by these 613 strict laws that the Christians lived by. So there's very few laws, very few ways to show that you're a Christian other than saying you're a Christian, and you only served one God. And so for many of the Romans, they considered the early Christians to be atheists, to really be against religion as a whole, because, well, they didn't have idols to worship, they didn't have many gods to worship, they didn't have all the customs that the Jews had, and they didn't have all the rituals that the pagan Roman gods had. And so what were they doing? And so many of these early Christians were considered to be atheists through the Roman officials. And so the way to kind of get away from being persecuted as a Christian was you had to denounce your Christianity, had to curse God, and had to accept some rite of the pagan rituals to the Roman gods. And so you had to do these 3 things in order to be not persecuted by the Roman officials. And so there were Christians who did that, just as there are Christians who would do that today. But regardless, we get to Polycarp. Polycarp is interesting here because if you study Polycarp, he says here in his last sentences, or in his last words, 86 years I have served God. And so Polycarp is somewhere between 86 years old and 90 years old when he is persecuted. Now, not only is that rare for our times of making it to almost 90 years old, but especially in this Roman Empire period of living. You would be lucky if you made it to 50 to 60 years old, let alone almost 90 years old. And so Polycarp being, we'll say 86, is really old for his time. And the judge who was overseeing this matter kind of felt for Polycarp. He didn't want to be the one to persecute an 86-year-old man. I don't think any of us would want to be in that kind of position. After all, he's lived his full life. Why would we want to end it off that if he's going to just end up dying soon anyway? On top of that, if we look into this a little bit more, Polycarp's last words as a whole, the judge wanted him to recount his faith. And basically the way you did that was by saying, away from me, you atheists. Kind of sounds like scripture when Jesus said, away from me, Satan. But basically you're renouncing the Christians by saying, get away from me, you atheists. Well, Polycarp, in his expressive final words, looks to the Roman court above him and says, away from me, you atheists. He doesn't look to the Christians, but he looks to the court judging him. And so the judge kind of grows angry and looks at Polycarp and says, don't you know I have beasts who are ready to eat you? Just as Ignatius died in that manner. Ignatius died in the Roman Colosseum. Much like you see in the movies about the gladiators, was they just often gave Christians to the tigers and to the bears and to the lions, oh my, of the Colosseum. And so this is what Polycarp is facing. And Polycarp basically tells the judge, okay, so you have bears. And then the judge says, well, if that's the case, then I'll burn you at the stake, which would have been far more painful than being eaten by a bear or by a lion or by a tiger. But Polycarp's final words here are, 86 years I've served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my King and my Savior? You threaten me with fire that burns for a season and after a little while is quenched. But you are ignorant of the fire of the everlasting punishment that is prepared for the wicked. Even Polycarp in his final moments was doing nothing but spreading the gospel, doing nothing but spreading the word. After that, Polycarp was tied to a stake and then set on fire. However, I think it's kind of ironic that it wasn't the fire that killed him. The fire didn't end him, and actually one of the guards had to come up and finally stab Polycarp with a sword. But the fire that was supposed to burn Polycarp was so hot that it ended up killing the Roman soldier that had stabbed Polycarp with the sword. Now, all of these stories are amazing. And we're not 100% certain of the validity of all of them. But it is something to tell us that we have these exact words written down that have survived all of these years. 2,000 years, and these words we still have. I believe there's been very specific reasons why we have the very words and not all the writings of the early fathers. But I hope you noticed, and I pointed out before, that the theme between these are love, faith, and courage. I'll have Anne come back up and we'll go into our time of invitation this morning. And I want us to look into that same aspect of things. Are we living a life of love, courage, and strength? If you were in these positions, how would you react? Would you excitedly still proclaim, even up until your final moments, that Jesus is King? Are you on guard? Are you ready to stand firm in your faith? Are you courageous and strong? And are you doing all of this in love? Not in fear of punishment, not out of expectation of reward, but simply out of love. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for providing this opportunity for us. That after 2,000 years we can safely come into this sanctuary. We can safely come before you. We can safely look into your word. But not only look into your word, but look to those who were after your word, who still had faith, who still carried your word in their hearts so that we may carry your word in our hearts as well. Lord, be with us this morning as we search our hearts, as we seek to see where we're at, standing beside you. Lord, search us and know us. Allow us to make a difference, to see where we are failing, but to also see where we are striving. Lord, be with us this morning and guide our hearts, guide our minds, guide our souls. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.